China has a peace plan, America has a war policy, and Europe, instead of having its own strategic approach, simply copies the American position. This powerful quote is from Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who now holds one of the most powerful positions in Europe. His government just assumed the presidency of the European Union for the remainder of 2024. And that means Viktor Orban, who recently met with Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Donald Trump, will have a tremendous amount of leverage over future EU decisions. It's important because on the other side of the world, NATO just concluded its 75-year anniversary event, and this defensive organization has officially switched gears and once again is making an offensive move. Their newest target is China, and NATO is now looking to expand to an entire new region of the world, Asia Pacific. But something remarkable happened over the weekend that could change the entire future of NATO. We've all seen the video of the assassination attempt on Republican frontrunner Donald Trump. The images coming out of the rally are shocking, and this event has changed the entire future of the US election and most likely the entire future of global geopolitics. We are reaching a tipping point, with the epicenter of political chaos being the United States and the 2024 election. During NATO's 75th anniversary event, Joe Biden delivered one of the most awkward moments in his career when he mistakenly introduced Ukraine's president as Mr. Putin. Of course, this was just a verbal gaffe from Biden, but the optics look bad, and his support is quickly declining as many voters now realize an 82-year-old Biden is no longer mentally capable of leading the United States. Meanwhile, Donald Trump not only survived a gunshot, but he will use this attempt on his life as valuable fuel to his re-election campaign. Nearly 25% of Americans now feel that patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country, and 75% believe that American democracy is at risk in the 2024 presidential election. To be honest, American democracy is at risk this November, and one organization that will be watching the US elections very closely is NATO, because here is where things get interesting. Donald Trump is the one person that NATO fears the most, because Trump has been an outspoken critic of the organization and pledged to make significant changes if he is re-elected. The 75-year NATO anniversary summit was supposed to be a grand event to showcase NATO's strength and rally behind Ukraine. But just listen to the words of former US Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who reveals what the summit actually did. Instead of strengthening NATO and showing its power, the summit did the opposite. It laid bare its cracks, its failures to deal with reality, and its incapacity to respond to the emergence of multipolarity. This is quite the statement from the former ambassador, and it couldn't be truer. While Joe Biden stood on stage and proclaimed the war will end with a Ukrainian victory and that Russia will not prevail, Biden's emotion and his words don't actually change the cold hard facts of what's happening on the battlefield. As of today, Russia has more manpower and more military equipment than it did at the start of the war. Ukraine has lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and this simple animation illustrates just how much of Ukraine's land has been destroyed and the new border that is emerging between Russia and Ukraine. This NATO summit was supposed to see another $100 billion for Ukraine. In the end, NATO could only agree on sending $40 billion. However, the biggest gift Ukraine received was a promise that its progress towards joining NATO is now, quote, irreversible. But let's be honest, these are empty words, as there is no such thing as irreversibility, and the NATO pledges of today don't guarantee future funding. This was first reported in the Wall Street Journal, who shares Ukraine's irreversible path to NATO is paved with uncertainty. In reality, NATO's joint communique is simply a friendly gesture, and NATO membership could easily be blocked if Donald Trump returns to the White House next year. The crazy part of this entire deal is that even if NATO wanted to admit Ukraine into the organization today, it couldn't, because the country's level of corruption is too high and too widespread to make Ukraine eligible for NATO in the first place. Which makes you wonder, why has the US been pushing Ukraine to NATO membership since 2008 if it's not even eligible to join? But here is where it all comes full circle, because last Thursday, Viktor Orban, who once again currently holds the rotating presidency of the European Union, flew to Florida to personally meet with Donald Trump. Now, typically, we don't see European leaders endorse US presidential candidates during election season, as they prefer to stay neutral and open to working with whoever wins the election. But Orban is standing by Trump, fully endorsing him for president, and together, they have a very different vision for Ukraine. When Orban met with Zelensky, he flat out told him that he was opposed to Ukraine's ascension into NATO, and instead urged the Ukrainian president to consider a ceasefire and, quote, speed up peace talks. If Donald Trump wins this November, the NATO alliance is going to look very different, as Trump vowed to end the Russia-Ukraine war before he is even sworn into office on January 20th. But now it's time to expose NATO's new plan. and how they are shifting the blame of the Russia-Ukraine war to the other side of the planet. China has emerged as NATO's next target, and the rhetoric coming out of the summit is quite remarkable. Just look at this official NATO statement. The People's Republic of China's stated ambitions and coercive policies continue to challenge our interests, security, and values. The deepening strategic partnership between Russia and the PRC and their mutually reinforcing attempt to undercut and reshape the rules-based international order are a cause for profound concern. Now, this is quite a bold statement for NATO to make when you consider the simple fact that NATO members have zero regard for international law when it comes to the carnage that has been unleashed in Gaza. The Lancet, one of the world's most respected medical journals, recently published a report that estimates Gaza death tolls are likely over 186,000 victims. But where is NATO and international law here? Once again, it doesn't matter, because NATO wants us to focus on China and believe that China is now responsible for the war in Ukraine. But allow me to give you 4 facts that prove this argument false. The first is that over 60% of Russia's imported military components come from the United States and Western allies. In addition, the US and its allies have yet to stop trading with Russia, with last year's trade exceeding $130 billion, or roughly 18% of Russia's foreign trade. But hold on, it gets even more absurd with the second fact. This graph shows the absolute explosion of India's imports from Russia. In fact, India has increased its imports of Russian oil by over 1,800% since before the war in Ukraine, while China has only increased its import of Russian oil by 43%. This fact was reported by French geopolitical commentator Arnaud Bertrand, who shares India has compensated for almost 70% of Russia's revenue loss from the EU, whilst China compensated for 25%. But only one of those countries is labeled as a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. The irony here is outstanding. China is the aggressor, while NATO calls India a partner for a peaceful, free, and democratic world. Now, for the record, I have no problem with India purchasing record amounts of Russian oil at a discounted price and then reselling that oil in the open market, by the way, mainly to Europeans, for a substantial profit. India sees an opportunity in the market and are simply capitalizing on it, which is fine because India is an independent country and should be allowed to do what's in their best national interests. It just amazes me that NATO can give India the pass while simultaneously blaming China, which makes fact number 3 even more fascinating, because China is actually helping Ukraine on the battlefield with its superior drone technology. Earlier in the war, American-made drones were heavily used by the Ukrainian army, but as this Business Insider report reveals, American drones are glitching and getting lost in Ukraine, giving way to a flood of Chinese drones. Once again, the great irony here is that not only is Chinese technology helping Ukraine, it's also powering the United States military as well. The CEO of Raytheon, one of America's largest weapons manufacturers, recently stated, if we had to pull out of China, it would take us many, many years to reestablish that capability, either domestically or in other friendly countries. Basically, if the United States ever found itself in a military battle against China, it would depend on Chinese technology for the resources to build up its military equipment. Check out this Bloomberg article, which reveals that even the Pentagon and the US Defense Department can't avoid doing business with China's Huawei because it's one of the world's most successful telecommunication brands with a dominant position throughout the globe. Once again, NATO and the US want you to believe that China is the biggest threat and an aggressor in Asia. But just look at this chart of US military bases throughout the region and focus on the Philippines, which the US military is planning to build 4 new military bases in the South China Sea. The truth is that NATO poses a serious threat to the future stability of Asia, and the first person to warn of this threat was none other than Kishore Mahbubani, a Singaporean diplomat who is the former president of the UN Security Council and authored this 2021 article entitled Asia Say No to NATO. The article is brilliant, and although it's over 3 years old, it's worth reading today because it states the absolute truth of what NATO expansion would mean for the region. The biggest danger we face in NATO expanding its tentacles from the Atlantic to the Pacific is that it could end up exporting its disastrous militaristic culture to the relatively peaceful environment we have developed in East Asia. Indeed, if NATO was a wise thinking and learning organization, it should actually be studying the East Asian record, especially the ASEAN record of preserving peace and learning lessons from it. Instead, it is doing the opposite, thereby creating real dangers for our region. In view of the risk to East Asia throughout the potential expansion of NATO culture, all of East Asia should speak with one voice and say no to NATO. Everyone, I have one final point to make, and it comes from this brilliant Financial Times article entitled "Seize Peace in Ukraine Before It's Too Late." This is an important article for the world to see because it was written and endorsed by some of the West's most influential voices on Russia relations, including Sir Anthony Brenton, British ambassador to Russia from 2004 to 2008, and Jack Matlock, the US ambassador to the USSR from 1987 to 1991. It goes on to state, Russia's latest military gains in the Donetsk region reinforce the case for a negotiated settlement of the war in Ukraine. All informed analysts agree that short of a serious escalation of war, the likeliest outcome will be a continued stalemate on the ground, with a not insignificant chance of a Russian victory. Reluctance by the official West to accept a negotiated peace rests on the belief that anything short of a complete Ukrainian victory would allow Putin to get away with it. But this ignores by far the most important outcome of the war so far, that Ukraine has fought for its independence and won it, as Finland did in 1939 and 40. Some territorial concessions would seem a small price to pay for the reality, rather than semblance of independence. If a peace based on roughly the present division of forces in Ukraine is inevitable, it is immoral not to try for it now. Just let that final sentence sink in for a moment, and remember the animation I shared earlier in today's video, and the new border that is being established between Russia and Ukraine. A peace deal can be settled on today that would allow Ukraine to retain its independence, and most importantly, stop this brutal war that is devastating the entire continent of Europe. I completely agree with the former US and UK ambassadors who argue that if this is a pathway for peace that exists today, which of course it does, it is immoral not to sit down and negotiate a peace settlement immediately. Everyone, we are just over 100 days left until the 2024 presidential election, and a lot will change between now and November 5th. Will Biden win his re-election campaign and endorse a NATO expansion to Asia? Will the Democrats replace Biden with a younger and more capable nominee? Or will Donald Trump ride the momentum he gained from this assassination attempt, win back the White House, and negotiate a peace settlement directly with Vladimir Putin? Honestly, anything is possible, and as always, we're going to break down all the future developments right here on this channel. Everyone, I'm coming live at you from Guangzhou, China. Behind me is the exhibition hall for the Canton Fair, and we have some amazing videos coming up on the channel right here from China and all things geopolitics. As always, I want to thank you for your incredible support. Drop me a comment down below, make sure you subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next video soon.